Arizona, 1873. A man is brought into a frontier jail on a Thursday evening. He has not been charged with anything specific. The sheriff tells him he will be held until the situation is clarified. The situation is never clarified. By Sunday, the man has lost 3 days of work, his wagon has been impounded, and the cargo he was transporting has been inventoried by a deputy who is also employed by the man who wanted that cargo route shut down. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you're about to hear is not the version most people know. If this is the kind of history that actually tells you something real, subscribe. We go deeper here than most. Here's a question for the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where the system that was supposed to protect you was the thing working against you, where the rules existed on paper but not in practice? Tell us. Because the frontier jail was exactly that kind of place, and the men who ran it understood it perfectly. Most people think a frontier jail was a place where dangerous men were kept away from decent society. A holding pen for outlaws, 4 walls, iron bars, a cot, and a lock. That image is not entirely wrong. It is just missing everything that actually mattered. The frontier jail was one of the most flexible instruments of control in the American West, not because it held criminals, because it could hold anyone, and in a legal environment where the definition of criminal was written by whoever held the sheriff's badge, the distance between a free man and a jailed man was often smaller than either of them wanted to believe. Think about what the law actually looked like on the frontier in the 1860s and 70s. In established cities back east, the law was a system. Courts, prosecutors, defense attorneys, written procedures, records, oversight. On the frontier, the law was frequently a single man with a badge, operating in a territory where the nearest judge might be 2 weeks' ride away, and the nearest circuit court session might happen twice a year. That man had almost unlimited discretionary power. He decided who got arrested. He decided how long a man stayed in the cell before any formal process began. He decided what charges were filed and whether they were filed at all. He decided who was released and on what conditions. There was no one watching him make those decisions except the men who had appointed him, and in many frontier towns, the men who had appointed the sheriff were the same men who needed the jail to work in their favor. But here's the problem. A jail that serves power rather than law does not look different from the outside. It has the same bars, the same lock, the same deputy sitting out front. The difference is invisible until you are inside it. Texas, 1871. A small rancher refuses to sell his water access rights to a larger operation that has been expanding through the valley for 2 years. He is within his legal rights. The deed is clear. The refusal is final. 3 weeks later, he is arrested on a charge of cattle theft. The evidence is thin, 1 witness, no recovered animals, no documentation. But the charge is filed, and the man sits in the jail for 11 days, waiting for the circuit judge to arrive. 11 days. His cattle are unattended. His fences go unrepaired. A section of his grazing land is occupied by the neighboring operation while he is inside, on the grounds that the boundary was always disputed, and now there is no one present to object. By the time he is released, charges dismissed, the witness having recanted, the practical damage is done. He sells the water rights 6 months later. The price offered is 1/3 of what it was before the arrest. The jail did not convict him. It did not need to. This was not unusual. This was the tool. And this is where things change, because the power of the frontier jail was not primarily in what it did to the men inside it. It was in what it communicated to the men outside it. Every arrest that was visibly unjust and went unchallenged was a demonstration. It told everyone watching that the system wouldn't protect them if the wrong people decided they needed to be moved. It told them that resistance had a cost. It told them that cooperation was safer. A man watching his neighbor get arrested on a thin charge and held for 10 days does not need to be told anything directly. He draws his own conclusions. He becomes more careful about who he disagrees with. He becomes more willing to accept terms he might otherwise have pushed back against. He becomes, in the language of the frontier, manageable. That was the real function of the jail in many frontier settlements. Not punishment, management. But it gets worse. Because the jail was not only used against individuals, it was used against entire categories of people who had no political standing in the territory and therefore no practical recourse when the system turned against them. In frontier towns with significant populations of Chinese laborers, the jail was a chronic presence. Men arrested for minor infractions that would have been overlooked in others, held for extended periods on fees they could not pay, released into conditions that made rearrest almost inevitable. The cycle was not accidental. It served the interests of men who wanted a dependent, controllable labor supply that couldn't organize or leave without risking immediate arrest. A labor crew working a mining operation in California, 1868. The men are owed 3 weeks of back wages. They stop work. They gather outside the mine office. They are not violent. They are standing in a group, which is enough. The sheriff arrives within the hour. 6 men are arrested for disturbing the peace. They are held for 5 days. When they are released, the leverage they had is gone. The wages are paid at a reduced rate. No one challenges the accounting. The jail made that possible, not the bars, the timing. Ask yourself this. If you knew that stopping work, or raising your voice, or simply standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment could put you in a cell for a week with no formal charge and no clear process for getting out, how would that change the way you operated? How loud would you be willing to be? The men on the frontier who had no political standing learned the answer to that question early, and they adjusted. Now let's talk about what the inside of the jail actually looked like, because the physical conditions of frontier incarceration tell you something important about how the system understood the people it held. The standard frontier jail cell in the 1860s and 70s was not designed for long-term occupation. It was designed to hold men for days or weeks, long enough to serve its purpose, short enough that the cost of maintenance remained low. A wooden structure in many early settlements, sometimes reinforced with iron bars on the windows and a heavy lock on the door, sometimes not even that. In the earliest frontier towns, the jail was occasionally just a room in the back of the sheriff's office with a bolt on the outside of the door. The conditions were what they were. 1 bucket, no heat in winter, no ventilation in summer, food delivered once a day, if the deputy remembered, no medical attention, unless the situation became visibly critical, no visitors in many establishments unless the sheriff approved them, which he usually did not for the first several days. A man who went into a frontier jail in reasonable health could come out of it genuinely damaged by a 2-week stay. Not through deliberate mistreatment, simply through the accumulated effect of cold, poor food, no movement, and the particular psychological weight of confinement in a small space with no certainty of release. That weight was understood by the men who ran the jails, and it was factored into the calculation. A man held for 10 days in a frontier cell is not the same man who went in. He is tired. He is uncertain. He is aware, in a way he was not before, of how completely his situation can change without warning and without his consent. That awareness makes him more cooperative, less likely to resist, more willing to accept terms he would have rejected before the arrest. The jail was not a punishment. It was a softening process, and this is where things change again. Because the frontier jail also served a financial function that most accounts of the period overlook completely: the fees. In many frontier jurisdictions, a man held in jail was responsible for paying the cost of his own incarceration. Room and board, in the language of the time. The daily rate was set by the sheriff's office and varied considerably from one town to the next. It was not high by the standards of the time, usually 50 cents to $1 a day. But for a man who had been arrested while traveling, or pulled off his work, or separated from his assets by the circumstances of the arrest itself, even a small daily fee accumulated into a serious problem. A man held for 14 days at 75 cents a day owes $10.50 before he walks out the door. If he cannot pay, he stays. The longer he stays, the more he owes. The system was self-reinforcing in a way that bore a striking resemblance to debt bondage, not because anyone designed it to be necessarily, but because the incentive structure produced that outcome naturally. The sheriff collected the fees, or the county did, on paper, with the sheriff taking a percentage for administration. The distinction was often theoretical. The practical result was that the man running the jail had a financial interest in keeping it occupied. That interest did not always translate into abuse, but it created a condition in which the economic incentives pointed toward arrest rather than away from it, toward extended detention rather than quick resolution, and toward the targeting of men who could be held without serious political consequences rather than men whose detention would create problems. The men who were held longest in frontier jails were almost always the men with the least political standing. Not the most dangerous, the most vulnerable. But here's the problem with a system built on that logic. It corrodes the legitimacy of the law itself. A community that watches the jail being used selectively against the poor, against the foreign-born, against the men who inconvenience the wrong people, stops believing that the law is what it claims to be. The belief in law depends on its consistent application. When that consistency breaks down, the population does not necessarily revolt, it adapts. It learns to work around the system, to avoid drawing attention, to handle disputes through channels that do not involve the official legal structure, because the official legal structure cannot be trusted. Vigilante action on the frontier was not primarily a response to the absence of law. It was frequently a response to the presence of law that did not work as advertised. When men took justice into their own hands, it was often because they had already tried the official system and found it occupied by the interests of the men who ran it. A group of small ranchers in Wyoming, 1876. 3 of them have had livestock go missing over the course of a year. They have reported the losses to the sheriff. The sheriff has investigated and found nothing. The losses continue. One of the ranchers begins to suspect that the investigation is not being conducted in good faith, that the sheriff has a reason to look in the wrong direction. He is right, but he cannot prove it. The men handle the situation themselves. They are not proud of what they do, but they have calculated that the alternative, continuing to report to a system that is working against them, produces only more losses and no resolution. The calculus is cold and accurate. The frontier jail did not only hold men, it taught men what the law was actually for. And sometimes what it taught them led them away from the law entirely. Have you ever watched an institution that was supposed to serve everyone clearly serve only some, and made a decision based on that observation? Think about what that decision cost you and what would have happened if you had made the other choice. That was the calculation frontier men faced every time they considered whether to file a complaint, report a theft, or trust the system that was supposed to protect them. Now let's talk about something that the popular image of the frontier jail almost never includes: the men who worked inside it. The deputy was the lowest rung of the formal law structure on the frontier. He was often young, frequently underpaid, and almost always operating in conditions that no formal job description could have prepared him for. He was responsible for feeding the prisoners, maintaining the building, managing the paperwork, and being present when the sheriff was not, which was often, since sheriffs in large frontier counties could be raiding for days at a time, covering territory that covered hundreds of square miles. The deputy's position was one of significant informal power and very little formal oversight. He decided, in practice, how the jail was run on a daily basis. He decided how much food the prisoners got. He decided whether a prisoner's family could visit. He decided whether a man who complained about the conditions was moved to a worse cell or left where he was. He decided which of the men in the jail got small privileges: an extra blanket, a candle for the evening, a message passed to someone outside, and which did not. Those decisions were not made in a vacuum. They were made in the context of what the deputy knew about who was worth being kind to and who was not. And that knowledge came from the same network of relationships that ran through every other institution in the frontier town. A deputy who was unkind to the wrong prisoner, a man with connections, a man whose friends were watching, could find himself out of a job when the sheriff returned. A deputy who was strategically kind to a prisoner, who had information the sheriff needed, or whose goodwill might be useful later, was operating with a sophistication that the formal job description did not acknowledge, but that everyone in the system understood. The jail was run on relationships. Everything on the frontier was, but it gets worse still, because the frontier jail was not only a place where men were held, it was a place where men disappeared, not always dramatically, not always permanently, but with enough regularity that the disappearance became a known risk, something that men in certain positions understood could happen to them if the wrong sequence of events occurred. A man is arrested in Montana, 1874. He is held on a charge that is not fully specified. He is moved, after 3 days, to a facility in a neighboring county, a transfer that is documented in the paperwork, but that his family is not informed of. By the time his wife determines where he has been taken, another week has passed. The charge is eventually dropped. The man is released. He is not the same. That is a mild version of what disappearance looked like on the frontier. The severe version involved men who went into a cell and did not come out, not because of formal execution, but because the conditions, the lack of medical care, the isolation, and the absence of any external oversight produced outcomes that were never formally recorded as anything other than natural causes. The frontier jail had no external review, no inspector, no reporting requirement beyond what the sheriff chose to file with the territorial government, which in practice meant almost nothing, since the territorial government was itself a thin structure with limited capacity to investigate anything happening at the local level. A man could die in a frontier jail, and the official record would show whatever the sheriff wrote: illness, heart failure, an altercation with another prisoner. The man's family might never know the circumstances. The other prisoners who had witnessed something might not be in a position to say so, or might have already been released and moved on, or might understand that saying something would produce consequences they were not willing to accept. This was not the norm. Most men who went into frontier jails came out again. But the possibility of the severe outcome, the possibility that a man might go in and not come out, or come out damaged beyond recovery, was real enough that it functioned as a background threat for everyone who understood the system. That background threat was the jail's most powerful tool, more powerful than the bars, more powerful than the fees. The knowledge carried quietly among the men who had been around long enough to know that the frontier jail was a place where the ordinary rules of accountability did not fully apply. Now let's talk about the sheriffs themselves. Because the picture of the frontier lawman is almost completely wrong in the popular imagination, and understanding what sheriffs actually were changes everything about what the jail meant. The frontier sheriff was, in most jurisdictions, an elected official. He ran for office, won or lost based on local political dynamics, and served a term before facing re-election. That electoral structure sounds democratic. In practice, it meant that the sheriff owed his position to whoever could deliver enough votes to keep him in it. And in a frontier town where political organization was informal and the men with money controlled significant portions of the voting population, the sheriff frequently owed his position to the same men who needed the jail to work in their favor. This was not always corrupt in a simple sense. A sheriff could genuinely believe he was serving his community while also making decisions that consistently benefited the men who had backed his election. The relationship did not require explicit instruction. It required only an accurate understanding of whose goodwill was essential to continued employment. A man approaches the sheriff in a New Mexico town in 1878 with a complaint about a land boundary. The complaint is legitimate. The evidence is clear. The sheriff listens carefully and tells the man he will look into it. He does not look into it, not because he has been told not to, because the man on the other side of the boundary dispute has 20 employees, controls the largest payroll in the county, and has been publicly supportive of the sheriff's re-election campaign. The calculation is simple. The complaint disappears. The man with the complaint does not know why nothing happened. He knows only that nothing happened. He files the complaint again. Nothing happens again. He stops filing complaints. The jail, in this case, is never used. It does not need to be. The knowledge that it could be used and the observation that it is used selectively is sufficient to produce the desired behavior. That is the most sophisticated version of what the frontier jail actually was. Not a building, a signal, a permanent, visible reminder of what could happen to a man who pushed too hard against the wrong interests. The bars were real. The lock was real. But the power of the jail extended far beyond its physical walls into every decision made by every man in the territory who understood what he was looking at. Now consider what happened in the towns where the jail system eventually collapsed, where the sheriff lost credibility, where the selective enforcement became too visible to ignore, where enough men had been through the cell or watched someone else go through it that the fear it was supposed to generate had curdled into something else. Those towns did not become lawless overnight. But they became places where two parallel systems operated simultaneously. The official law, with its badge and its jail and its circuit judge visiting twice a year, and the informal law, the agreements made between men who had decided they could not rely on the official version. The disputes settled through channels that left no record, the justice delivered by people who had stopped expecting it from the system that claimed to provide it. The parallel system was not always fair. It was not always better than what it replaced, but it was more honest about what it was. It did not carry a badge and make promises it did not intend to keep. It was simply men deciding among themselves what was acceptable and what was not, and acting accordingly. The frontier jail produced that outcome in the towns where it was most consistently abused. By being too obviously a tool of the powerful, it delegitimized itself and the law it represented. The men who designed it as an instrument of control did not anticipate that the instrument would eventually teach the people it was used against that the control was not legitimate. That lesson took years to arrive. It arrived quietly. And when it did, it changed the character of the communities that learned it in ways that no amount of re-election campaigns or new sheriff appointments could undo. The bars rusted. The buildings decayed. The law that arrived later, the actual law, with actual courts and actual accountability, found communities that had already developed their own methods of resolution and were not entirely willing to hand them back. The frontier jail built that, not through failure, through success at the wrong thing. The cell was real. The justice was not always. Now let's consider what the frontier jail produced in the long run, not for the men inside it, but for the towns built around it. A town with a jail that is understood to be an instrument of the powerful rather than a protector of the weak develops a specific kind of social character. The men in it learn to be careful. They learn to avoid confrontation. They learn to settle things quietly between themselves without involving any official structure. They develop a culture of silence around disputes that might otherwise become public, not because they are cowardly, but because they have accurately assessed the cost of visibility. That silence has consequences. It means that abuses that should be exposed are not exposed. It means that men who have been wronged carry the weight of it privately rather than seeking redress through any available channel. It means that the social pressure that might otherwise correct the behavior of powerful men never builds to the point where it can force a change. The frontier jail, in its most successful deployments, produced communities where the powerful remained powerful and the vulnerable remained vulnerable, not through constant active enforcement, but through the accumulated weight of past enforcement. The arrests that had happened. The men who had gone in and come out changed. The deals that had been signed in the days after a release. The complaints that had been filed and had quietly disappeared. Those events did not need to be repeated constantly. They needed to be remembered, and they were remembered. The memory of what the jail could do, and had done, was enough to maintain the structure that made it useful in the first place. A young man arrives in a frontier town in 1879. He is 23 years old. He asks questions that the older men around him stopped asking years ago. He is not reckless. He is simply new, and he does not yet understand the specific shape of the silence that surrounds him. An older man takes him aside one evening, does not explain everything, just tells him to be careful about who he talks to and what he says in public about certain subjects. The young man asks why. The older man is quiet for a moment. Then he says something about a neighbor, something that happened 3 years ago. The neighbor asked the wrong questions in public and found himself in the jail for 8 days on a charge that was never explained and never prosecuted. When he came out, he sold his property at a loss and left the territory. No one knows where he went. The young man understands. Not completely, but enough. He adjusts. He becomes, over time, one of the men who does not ask certain questions in public, who settles disputes quietly, who advises the next newcomer to be careful. The frontier jail reproduced itself through the people it had processed. It did not need to arrest every person who might become a problem. It only needed to arrest enough of them that the lesson spread on its own. which it did, efficiently, quietly, across generations. That is the final shape of what the frontier jail was. Not a building where criminals were held, a machine for producing a specific kind of social order, one in which the men with power faced minimal effective resistance, and the men without power understood the cost of providing it. The bars were there for the men who had not yet learned. For the ones who had, the bars were unnecessary. But here's the problem. Networks of obligation always break somewhere. Let's talk about what happened when a frontier jail lost its grip, when the sheriff was replaced, when the political winds shifted, when a new wave of settlers arrived who did not carry the accumulated memory of what the cell could do and were not yet afraid of it. Those moments were the most volatile in a frontier town's history. Not the violent moments, the gunfights, the robberies, the range wars that made it into the newspapers. The quiet moments when the system of informal control based on the threat of the jail stopped functioning because the threat was no longer credible. A new sheriff arrives in a Kansas town in 1880. He is not connected to the men who ran the previous administration. He arrests the wrong man, a man with connections to the old network, on a legitimate charge. He holds him without the usual accommodations. He files the paperwork correctly. He does not accept the usual arrangement. The men who had relied on the jail as a tool for 20 years find themselves facing a building that no longer works the way they are accustomed to. They adjust. They find other methods. They work around the new sheriff. But the specific power of the jail, the power that rested on the credibility of selective enforcement, has been disrupted. And it takes years to rebuild, if it rebuilds at all. In the meantime, the town is different. Men who had been silent begin to speak. Complaints are filed that go somewhere. Disputes are settled through official channels that actually function. The underlying property relationships do not change overnight, but the environment in which they exist becomes slightly more honest. That change was fragile. It depended on the new sheriff remaining uncorrupted, on the political structure that supported him remaining intact, on the men who had previously controlled the jail not finding a way to reassert their influence through other mechanisms. In many towns, the change did not last. The old network adapted, and the jail reverted to its previous function under new management. But in some towns, it held. And in those towns, what replaced the old system was not perfect. Nothing on the frontier was perfect, but it was closer to what the law said it was supposed to be. A mechanism for protecting people rather than managing them. An institution that worked, at least some of the time, for the people who needed it rather than against them. Those towns are the ones that became something not because they were lucky, because at a specific moment in their history, the jail stopped being a tool and started being what it claimed to be. The difference between those towns and the ones that stayed locked in the old pattern was not geography or resources or the quality of the people who lived in them. It was the moment when enough men decided that the cost of accepting the system was higher than the cost of challenging it. That moment arrived differently in different places. Sometimes it was a single arrest that went too far. Sometimes it was an accumulation of smaller decisions. Sometimes it was the arrival of someone from outside who did not understand that certain things were not supposed to be questioned. The frontier jail ended, eventually, everywhere. Formal law replaced informal law. Courts replaced discretion. Records replaced memory. The bars remained in some places as historical artifacts, buildings preserved and labeled, visited by people who look at the old lock and the old cot and think about outlaws and sheriffs and the romance of a time that was harder and simpler than their own. It was not simpler. It was more complicated in ways that left almost no record. The record that exists is the official one, the charges filed, the sentences served, the men whose names appear in the ledgers. The record that does not exist is the one that mattered more, the complaints that were never filed, the deals signed in the days after a release, the questions that were not asked in public because an older man had taken a younger one aside and explained quietly the specific shape of what had happened to a neighbor 3 years ago. That record lives nowhere except in the understanding that the frontier produced in the people who passed through it. An accurate, hard-won, completely undocumented understanding of what institutions are actually for, as opposed to what they say they are for. And here is the final question before we close. When you think about the institutions that exist in a society to enforce the rules, the jails, the courts, the offices with the badges, and the authority, how do you know whether those institutions are working for you or against you? How do you know whether the protection being offered is real or whether it is a performance designed to keep you cooperative while someone else benefits from your compliance? The men on the frontier learned to read that question carefully. Not all of them, not quickly, but the ones who stayed long enough and watched closely enough developed an accurate understanding of what the system around them was actually doing, as opposed to what it said it was doing. That gap between the stated purpose and the actual function was the real dark truth about frontier jails. Not the conditions inside the cells, not the selective arrests, the gap, the distance between the law as written and the law as practiced, the fact that the two things wore the same uniform and carried the same badge and stood behind the same bars. The cell was real. The justice was not always. That's Mystery Wild West. And we'll see you in the next one.